Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm Tara Willerup, and I am a trustee of the Simsbury Free Library, and we're so happy to have you here tonight to welcome Kathy Hermes, Hermes. Beyond Massaco is what we're going to talk about tonight. Kathy is the publisher of and executive director of Connecticut Explored, which is a magazine that you have at your seats or by the door. Please feel free to take what she brought them as gifts. And a discount coupon if you want to become a subscriber. And it's a great magazine that shows us all the history of Connecticut in a very fun and fascinating way. I read it every month, every time it comes out, and it's a really well done and interesting message. It has great messages. Kathy here is, she's a JD from Duke University School of Law, her PhD in Colonial American History from Yale University. She's a professor emerita from Central Connecticut State University in the History Department, where she taught Anglo-American legal history, Native Americans of the Eastern Woodlands, as well as other courses in early America. So she is so talented, and we're so lucky to have her. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. I have to remind myself not to shout because I have this kind of lecture room voice, but now I'll get a microphone. It's dangerous. So it's great to be here. I hope you all will look at the issue of Connecticut Explored, especially the students, because there's a project mentioned in there about the New Haven court records that may have some searchable sources for you guys. So tonight we're going to talk about Beyond Massaco, the indigenous people of Simsbury and New Hartford. And of course, I'm from Cincinnati, so I always mispronounce words, and I used to say Massaco, because that just sounded right to me in my Midwestern kind of accent. But I've since learned, to kind of change the stress on the syllables. So Massaco was the original village of the Tunsis people who lived in Simsbury, and it was not a tribe. And that's the first thing I want to start with, because you will read in antiquarian books sometimes that the Massacos were a tribe. They're really part of the Tunsis people. And this is a map created by Darlene Kashuk of the Scatticook tribal nation. Where you see Wiantanong, that is actually where the Scatticook are now, over in the Kent area. And the Scatticook are one of the 5 recognized tribes in Connecticut. Right now, we have only 2 federally recognized tribes, meaning that they have a relationship with the federal government. Does anybody know what those tribes are? The Mashantucket Pequot is one, and the Mohegan, very good. But we have state-recognized tribes as well, without federal recognition. Does anybody know who they are? The Scatticook. Okay. And the Pawgasset, the Bridgeport area, the Golden Hill Pawgasset, as they're known. And then the Eastern Pequot. Okay, we're not on the map. Partly this is a map to sort of show you the pre-colonial location of the tribes. And so at the time before colonization, the Scatticook didn't exist because the Scatticook were formed as a remnant tribe to absorb peoples who had lost so many members from disease or from warfare, they could no longer function as a tribe. So they kind of all merged together into the Scatticook nation. So many of the maps that you will see of the peoples of Connecticut are inaccurate. You will often see, for example, you can see the Connecticut River, right, flowing through the middle there. And you'll often see a tribe called the Sikyiogs. Well, that is actually a village. The village of Sukyog was Hartford. And the people who lived there were Wangunk. And the Wangunk invited the English into Connecticut. So they're responsible for all of this. The Wangunk were a very large people, a very significant tribal people, but you will find very few references to that tribal name in Connecticut history books. Because very soon after the settlers moved to Connecticut, there was the Pequot War of 1637. And the Pequot War was fought between the colony of Connecticut, the Mohegan and the Narragansett, all on one side, and then the Pequot on the other. And the Mohegan actually broke off from the Pequot in a kind of family split between two sachems or chiefs, Uncas, who became the Mohegan sachem, and Sassacus, who was the original Pequot sachem. Right? So this was a breach between one group of people, and that's why they're shown there with a hyphen between them. Mohegan and Pequot were one people. And the Wangunk actually were all along the river, and sometimes people call them the river tribes, or they refer to them by village names, like the Mattabesics, right? But these were just villages, like Massaco was a village of the Tunxus, Mattabesic was a village of the Wangunk. So one of the things that you always have to do if you're researching Native people in Connecticut is you have to remember that there's a lot of misinformation. So at the end, I have a bibliography that will give you some good sources to look at. One of the most important events in the history of Simsbury is the Massaco fire. In April 1642, the governor allowed for inhabitants of Windsor to move over to this area and basically start some tar pits and things like that so you could get some industry going. And while they were manufacturing pitch and tar, there was a fire allegedly set by Manahanus, and he was arrested and he was fined 500 fathom of wampum. Now, a fathom is long, and wampum is made from shells that are strung together, right? So the wampum has to be carved and whittled down into a bead. So 500 fathoms of wampum is a huge amount of work, right? And these have to be woven into belts. So Manahanus could not pay. He tried to get other Native people to help him, and Native people did indeed try to do that. But eventually, because he couldn't pay, he was forced to give a deed to John Griffin. Nobody knows if he really started that fire or not. Fire was something that kind of obsessed the colonists. They were very afraid of it for very good reasons, right? Everything was made of wood. They could be easily hurt and destroyed if there was a town fire. So in 1657, for example, another Native man, nicknamed Cherry, was accused of starting a fire and killing a family in Farmington. So these fire stories, we don't know how much truth there is in them, but they reflect colonial fears about interacting with Native people and having the Native people turn on them. The settlement at Massaco took a long time to get going, really. As people started moving in, there got to be about 40 families. Nessahegan, who was the sachem of the Pequannock, transferred land to John Mason. Now, John Mason is an important person in Connecticut history because he was one of the captains who commanded the Connecticut colony forces during the Pequot War. And we're actually having an issue in Connecticut Explored. Our summer issue is going to deal with some of the Mason controversy. Mason is the one who, with Underhill and Gardner, killed the Pequot at the Mystic Fort. And so his reputation for a couple of centuries was as a great hero, and now I think it has shifted to, he was genocidal in his wiping out of women and children at the Mystic Fort. And somewhere in between, there are a lot of differing opinions and reasons why he's seen that way. He was a founder of Windsor. He was governor of, or he was deputy governor of Connecticut and then acting governor of Connecticut during another famous episode in the 1660s when there were witchcraft trials in Hartford. So Mason has been associated with, you know, a lot of Connecticut's development, but also a couple of its major controversies. And he had a relationship with the native people, and a lot of land was transferred to Mason and his family over a couple of centuries. So eventually, land starts to move into colonial hands, and in that should be 1684, I'm sorry, I transposed the numbers there. In 1684, the Tunxus said that the original Massaco deed that they had signed was not binding to the lands at Weetag. So, so another deed was signed for that. And we want to look at who signed these deeds. These are names that come up over and over again. And these are just a few of the names, but I called them out because they're really some of the important leaders here in this area. Nessahegan, that man signed deeds all over the place. He was prominent, and yet he's somebody that we don't know all that much about. Besides his signature on deeds and a few court records that show him, for example, engaged in night walking, which meant being out after curfew, right, and walking around the town at night, probably causing a little trouble. We don't have a lot of information about him. We have a little bit of a genealogy where we know his children, but we don't know the names of his wives and things like that. We know his grandson was Toto, and Toto was involved also in accusations that he murdered a colonist. Sikhet was the son of Soik. Soik was the grand sachem of the Wangung. And Soik had many children from many wives. And part of the reason that I think he's unknown to you, and the Wangung are unknown to you, is that their leadership was very diffuse, right? So many towns had one of Soik's children as either a sachem, a chief, or a sungsquaw, an elder woman. And so people began to think of these as like separate tribes, but they weren't. They were all part of a kind of confederacy led by Soik, who then died in 1650 and was succeeded by his children in these various areas. Nanapusha's wife signed the deeds, and one of the things you'll often see so-and-so squaw. I didn't put the word squaw up there. But squaw is just a word for woman in Algonquian languages. And the Algonquian languages go from, what we now call Virginia on up to the St. Lawrence River Valley. So the word squaw is not derogatory, except as used as a pejorative deliberately, or sometimes when used in the West, where Algonquian languages were not spoken. So Nanapusha's wife was the daughter of Petus. Petus is sometimes identified as Tunxus, but he was Wangung. He was the son of Turamagus, and Turamagus was the son of Soik. But when Petus married a Tunxus woman, he became part of the Tunxus tribe, because this was a matrilineal, matriarchal society in which leadership descended from women. Now, men were the leaders, were the political leaders, but it was through a woman's line that a man became important. The most important man in anybody's life was the maternal uncle, right? The eldest maternal uncle, because that was the man who taught the men of the family. So it's a very different way about thinking of lineage. And Wisho, Wano's wife, Wano was a sachem. Wisho, we know nothing about her other than the fact that she signed these deeds. And sometimes the colonists would blend together the names, so her name sometimes is written as Wisho Wano Squaw, And it just means Wisho, Wano's wife. Right? That's how you parse it out. Mamanto's wife, Mamanto was a leader here at Massaco. And Cherry, we'll talk about Cherry some more. He's the one who was accused of killing the colonists with fire. And these leaders were not just leaders in a small geographic area. They really, the sachem's power, or the Sungsquaw's power, was related to the people whose lives they were responsible for. So anywhere a tribal person was, that tribal person could expect the protection of the sachem or the Sungsquaw, right? So this is very different than today. Like, if you leave Connecticut now and you get in trouble in Ohio, the Connecticut governor is not going to help you, right? But if a native person, if a Tungus person went to New York and got in trouble there, it was his sachem here who would be expected to come to his aid. Now, one of the most famous events in Simsbury history is, of course, King Philip's War. It's one of the most important events in all of New England because it was the bloodiest war. In New England, 75% of the native population died in King Philip's War, and 25% of the colonial population. It was very, very devastating. And a number of native people joined King Philip, but a lot of them also joined the colonists, right? So there's a split in the indigenous population as to their loyalties. And we see here a list of Indians that went up to Springfield. This list includes Wangunk, Tungus, Podunk, Niantic, and other native people. And they went up to Springfield to fight against King Philip. But something happened in Springfield. They were under the command of Captain Samuel Mosley. And Mosley was, as they say, an Indian hater. And he did something so disgusting that I think it probably drove a lot of the native people to abandon him and his troops. A native woman came to him with information about King Philip's whereabouts. She was trying to be friendly to him, and he had her torn apart by dogs. That kind of viciousness, right, created a lot of angst among native people who had been considered friendly to the colonies, because, their loyalties now were being challenged. Turamagus, a Wangunk sachem, Massaco, another Wangunk sachem, were held as hostages in Wethersfield during King Philip's War to make sure that the Wangunk didn't go over to the enemy. But a number of the people on this list abandoned their troops, and we don't see them again until a list of surrenderers appears in 1678, where they're kept in a kind of prison camp along the Shetucket River, near where the Shetucket and the Quinnebog rivers meet. And they're held there for 10 years. They can only get out of the prison camp after 10 years if they promise to behave like colonists and live in a Connecticut town. Now, Simsbury was directly affected by King Philip's War in a way that some of the other towns in Connecticut were not. Connecticut troops came very close, and then there was the burning of Simsbury in August of 1676. And when a native person was questioned, that's Menormeet, when he was questioned about who was responsible for the burning of Simsbury, he said, Wekwash, Wewas, Wasamo, Hawawase, Makawat, Sanchimors, Wasankachi, and those names appear. Some of those names appear on the list of those who went up to Springfield, right? Wawase, they're spelled a little differently. Awashimum is probably Wasamo, and Munkanau is probably Makawat. And this is the reason that the spellings are so different is because it's all about transliteration, right? Not translation, but transliteration, where you're hearing the word spoken and you write it down phonetically. And there were no spelling rules in the 17th century. This is what makes reading documents so hard. John Winthrop spelled Winthrop 8 different ways. It was always pronounced the same and everybody knew who he was, but with native names, there's a lot of confusion, and sometimes people don't see that a native person is really the same over a course of several documents because they're not sure about the spelling or the phonetic pronunciation of the name. Now, I know you can't read this. This is from a newspaper clipping in Middletown. It's a story about Middletown from the Boston Newsletter in 1736. So newspapers were first published in the colonies. The first one came out in 1691. It was just one page and it lasted a day. The Massachusetts Bay Colony decided they weren't that crazy about newspapers. But eventually, in 1704, the Boston Postboy got started, or the Boston Evening Post, and it went on for a little while. And then you started to get more newspapers. Does anybody know the longest lasting newspaper from the colonial period to the present day?
The Current.
The Hartford Current, right, you are. The Hartford Current, published continuously from 1764 to now. So anyway, one of the things that's so interesting about this publication here is that it says, we hear from Hartford and the colony of Connecticut that the Indians lately had a meeting for a dance at Middletown. Now, this dance was probably a religious ceremony, a traditional religious ceremony led by a powwow. And a powwow was a person, not an event. The powwow was the ceremonial leader, a shaman of sorts. Okay? At which time the Reverend Mr. Treat went among them to prevent, if possible, the excesses which they usually run onto on such occasions. And was so successful in his endeavors that a considerable number of the Moheags and some that belonged to Farmington and Middletown withdrew from the rest, and keeping in good order, while it was sorrowful to behold others wallowing in their licentiousness, but by this means, in the midst of their jovial frolic, they were broke up. That's long-winded. But, and I know all those S's look like F's, right? So when you look at excesses, looks like F's, those are long S's, not F's. So anyway, what is this saying? Well, it's showing now that there's starting to be a pan-Indian movement, right? So remember in King Philip's War that some native people went over to King Philip who were not of the Wampanoag tribe. Philip was Wampanoag. And he managed to get Narragansetts, Massachusetts, some Nipmuc, clearly some Wangunk, maybe a few Tuxas to join with him. And that was one of the first times that you saw kind of an intertribal union. But Connecticut's tribal peoples were so constricted on reservations, right? So there was a Wangunk reservation, there was the reservation, various reservations for the Pequots and the Mohegans. They're restricted on reservations, and so when they get together, it's often a large gathering that's intertribal. And one of the things that starts to happen is some of them start to Christianize. And Christianity becomes a kind of supranational identity, something bigger than their tribal identity. They will eventually come together as something known as the Brother Town movement, and eventually the Brother Town tribe. And I'll talk more about them later, but this is kind of the beginning of it, right here. As they start to be pulled away. We hear also that these poor creatures had gathered in a great body last fall from New Milford, Connecticut, and other places to wash off their mourning, as they call it, by a dance. When John Matawan, a Christian youth at Farmington, was so affected that he came to the Honorable Governor Talcott at Hartford for advice, who told him to make haste back and get all the youth together who, as he said, had desired him to come to the governor, and then go all in a body to the dance, and there openly testify against their vicious manners and the bad effects of such customs, which they did and were instrumental to abate the frolic and shame their parents for their drunkenness. This packs a lot in there. One of the things that we see is that Farmington is starting to become a place for Christian Indigenous people to gather. Eventually, in the 1770s, there will be a school there, led by a Mohegan named Joseph Johnson. And if you're ever interested, you can read the diary of Joseph Johnson and his letters, because they've been transcribed and published in a book. The drunkenness, right? Before colonization, there was no alcohol in North America. I know a lot of times people don't believe it when I say that, but Native people did not drink alcohol. And Native people don't tolerate it very well. And this has been documented medically, right? That they lack an enzyme that helps to process alcohol. So alcohol for a Native person often did a lot more damage than to Europeans who had been habituated to it and who had a greater tolerance for it physiologically. So one of the interesting things about drunkenness is that initially when Native people would get drunk and cause trouble, and they might get arrested, they would say in colonial courts, "This is your fault," right? "I never had alcohol before, and some colonist gave it to me, and this is your problem to solve, not mine." And colonial courts actually listened to this, and often would go after the person who had given or sold the alcohol to the native. So eventually, it became against the law to give or sell liquor to Indigenous people. That didn't stop it from happening, and that didn't stop them from obtaining it. But there was a recognition that this was a problem the colonists inflicted on the Native people, and colonists ought to help them. That began to change after King Philip's War, when Native people were increasingly blamed for their own drunkenness and punished for it. And Native people were the first to get together and form temperance societies. What's a temperance society?
AA.
Yeah, AA is a modern day temperance society, right? So they're the first to kind of get together and have groups to try to help people stop drinking. And we also, see here, as I mentioned, this nascent Christianizing. Native people had a hunger for knowledge. They were at first, of course, very suspicious of books. And there's a wonderful compilation by John Eliot, who was an apostle to the Indians, as he was called. And he had a collection of stories that he published from Native missionaries who would go out to their own people and try to convert them. And what the people say to the missionaries when they come with the Bible is, "That book, we know what's in that book. You trick us with that book. Get that book away from us." But eventually, I think that a lot of Native people come to see that they can do something on their own with Christianity. that it doesn't have to just be inflicted upon them as a colonizer's religion, but that there might be things in there that they want and need. Now, again, I know this is a little bit hard to read, and you don't really, it's not important that you read all the names, but the Tungus and the Wanga, the Mohegan and the Quinnipiac were interwoven in the 18th century in Farmington. So we have here Taramugus, who was the son of Soeg, I've mentioned him, had a son, Petishu, or Petus. Petus is the one who signs the confirmatory deed of Farmington. He was married to a Tungus wife, we don't know her name, right? But as I mentioned, he's got to become part of her family now, right? And he has children. Nanapush's wife is his daughter, and then Ahamo is his son, and Ahamo has descendants, right? And you can't see them all there, but this is Ahamo, and he's got a daughter, right? And having daughters was important, right? In native culture, it's less important in colonial culture in terms of inheritance. The other children of Taramugus, it's interesting, Rebecca, or she takes on an English name, Rebecca, and marries Benjamin Beckley, and there are still descendants of that family alive today, and we know what happened to them, right? I've been contacted by some of those descendants, and you can trace many lines through that. So there are still people, are still Wanga people, and there were also relationships through trade, both with one another and with colonists. So Tracy Wilson, who's was a teacher in West Hartford and now runs West Hartford's Witness Stones program, she did some research with the account books of John Whitman from Farmington, and in here you can see the names Cornelius Indian, for example, Wampy, Robin Squaw. All of these people were trading in blankets and baskets and corn and foodstuffs and many other, and clothing. And they all lived in this Farmington area because the Wangunk Reservation was sold off beginning in 1757 through 1765. And then the last Wangunk sachem recognized by the colony died in 1765. His name was Cushel. So a lot of Wangunk departed and moved to Farmington, where they got land lots. They also had relationships in law. One of the very interesting things that is unique to the Wangunk and the Tungus is that they embraced colonial law as a means to try to survive. It did not always work, I will point that out. But they tried, and they tried through the use of probate court. Probate court is where you go when somebody dies, and their estate is administrated. Or they leave a will, and they say how they want their lands and their goods distributed, and what happens to their children. And you see here how many Wangunk participated in the probate court, and how many Tungus compared to some of the other tribes, right? And most of the people in those other tribes who have wills or estate administrations also had some connection to Farmington and that Christian community there. Oh, I want to talk about the principles for a minute. Most of my academic work is not spent doing genealogy. I'm actually a legal historian who studies the law of indigenous people in the colonial period. And I don't mean the colonial law per se, but the actual indigenous law. And way back when, I asked myself, what did Native people who came to colonial courts want? What was their sense of justice, right? And did they ever get to articulate that? And what I found is they did indeed get to articulate it. They would often come to court and say, what you have done is unjust, and explain to the colonists why it was wrong, why it violated some custom that they had or some law that they had. And always at the core were these three things: reciprocity, patience, and consensus. I'm gonna step out of Connecticut for a minute to tell you a story that is from the Jesuit Relations about Native people among the Mohawk and the Huron. The French settled what we now call Canada, right? And there were Jesuit priests there. And one day the priests are having a gathering with French families and Native families. And a European boy is playing a drum, and a Native boy comes up and is interested in the drum, and when the European boy puts it down, the Native boy picks it up and starts to play it. And the European boy comes over and knocks him down and beats him up. And so the French people grab the European boy, the French boy, right, and they're gonna whip him. And the Native people are all distraught. They're like, no, don't do this, right? Don't whip this kid. And the French say, well, this is our way. He hurt your kid, right? The one that belongs to you, he hurt that kid. Don't you want us to punish our boy? And say, no, we don't know what this kid will be like when he grows up. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. But no, we don't know what he'll be like when he grows up. We have to be patient. We have to wait and see what kind of man he becomes. And if he becomes a bad man, well, maybe we could punish him then. But let's wait a while. Yeah. And the Europeans just don't understand this, right? But you see it time and again. There's this idea of waiting. And Europeans are impatient with everything. They want to just get moving. And in a Native council, for example, where you have, say, 30 Native people, Native men usually, making decisions, every man speaks. And you have to wait, and you have to listen to each individual. This drove the Europeans crazy. Treaty meetings were always, the Europeans are just, like, oh, come on, can we get on with it? And the Native people are taking their time to listen. And then they want the Europeans to do the same thing. And the Europeans are like, can we just move it along? And I think it's very frustrating for Native people to engage in this practice all the time, right, of trying to persuade and listen. Religion became a way for colonized Native people in Connecticut to find an identity. And yes, it was a Christian identity, but it was something where they could set the rules. So the Brothertown movement began with a man named Samson Occam, who was taught by Reverend Eliza Wheelock, the founder of Dartmouth College. And there was a school, Moore's Charity School, formed in Lebanon in the 1750s that had Native students. And out of that came a lot of Native ministers and religious, and even girls attended, and they became the wives of those ministers. And some of them moved to Farmington. And Eliza Wheelock took Occam to England to raise money for an Indian school, which he meant to be Dartmouth, right? Eventually Occam figured out, Occam was Mohegan, eventually Occam figured out that that money was not going to go to build an Indian school, that it was going to be a white school. And he became very disillusioned with Wheelock and broke with him and started the Brothertown movement. And initially it was mostly Mohegan, but at Farmington it brought in, the Quinnipiac, who were having a hard time surviving in the New Haven, Hamden area. And it brought in the Wangunk, who no longer had a reservation. And then it brought in Tungus people who were already in Farmington. And Timothy Indian left a will. And in his will and in his inventory, you see that he's got a Bible, he's literate. You find him and others mentioned in Joseph Johnson's diary and in letters. The Occam papers are at Dartmouth, ironically, and they are online, some of them are online. You also see these names appear in church records. Now, a while back, the State Library asked for churches to send in information from their church records. Not the actual records, but abstracts, right? An index of what was in them. And for almost every town, you can look and see all of the people who were in a congregation who appear in existing church records. The way these were cataloged in the abstracts, at the back of each book is the people with no surnames. And the people with no surnames are native people, not because they didn't have them, but because the colonists didn't bother to learn them, and people of African descent. So here we see Abigail, Indian in the care of Eunice. Abigail's probably Abigail Sanchoos, a Wangan. Eunice is probably Eunice Wambi of the Tungus, prominent Tungus family. We see here several Hannahs, a Jerusha, Patience. Patience is married to Samuel Nicol. She's listed, her baptism is listed, and her marriage, and Charles's her marriage to Samuel. Then we see Samuel Indian baptized, so on it goes. Sarah Indian, and so on. These people are sort of considered unknown in histories. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of genealogy here, so bear with me. In 1999, I transcribed some wills and estate administrations. And I'll admit freely, I did not know what I was doing. I mean, I knew how to transcribe, but I didn't know who these people were, or why they were important, or why their wills happened to be in the Hartford County court records. There were just a few of them. And I saw this guy, Ben Cushoy, his estate administration was in there. And when I looked in the Indian archives at the State Library, I saw Cushoy. But Cushoy lived longer than Ben, and who was Ben? And I didn't have any idea who these people were. I eventually settled on saying they were all Wangunk. And I got a letter from a guy named Timothy Ives, who was at this time working on his master's degree at UConn, and he said, you can't say that these people are Wangunk, because these could be Metabesics or other river tribes. And eventually, Tim wrote an actual amazing article on ethnohistory and a great master's degree on Wangunk land distribution. And he came to agree with me that all these people were Wangunk. But the reason that it was so hard to figure out is that nothing spelled it out in Connecticut history books. So I started doing genealogical trees on Ancestry, and then eventually some computer science students at CCSU and I created what we call relationship tree, which is actually better when you're dealing with Native people, because we don't often know who's a cousin. Like, are they a maternal cousin, a paternal cousin, which way does it go? But we know there's a relationship, a kinship relationship. So the relationship tree allows you to put in all different relationships: master-slave, master-servant, lawsuit, plaintiff and defendant. You can put in all kinds of relationships, and that helped me figure out a bunch of things. Now, one of the first probate records to appear in the Hartford County probate court records was in 1692. A woman named Mary McCompass comes to court, and she tells the court she doesn't want her infant daughter, whose father is Mingo and belongs to, I now forget who she belongs to, but anyway, Mingo belongs to somebody who's enslaved, right? She doesn't want her daughter to become enslaved, essentially. And so she wants her cousin Sarah to raise this child. Now, I didn't know who Sarah was, right? One of the things, I don't know, have you guys read Huckleberry Finn? Right? Remember when Huck is in a disguise and he tells, he's sewing with a woman, he's trying to thread a needle, and she's asking him what his name is, and he says Sarah, and then he says Mary, and then he says Hannah or something, like that. Every Native woman is Sarah, Mary, Hannah. They're, the names are just ubiquitous. So you don't know who's who, and it's very hard to figure out. But eventually I realized something, that, and I'm not going to tell you how I pieced it all together, but eventually I realized that Sarah Onepenny was the Sarah named in this probate record. Sarah Onepenny the Elder, who was married to a warrior named Powamskin. And in the records in Farmington, the probate records of Farmington, I found Amy Powamskin's will. Now, in Ancestry.com, this is cataloged as the will of Amy Square, because they misread the word squaw. And so even though it clearly says Amy Powamskin, that's not how they cataloged it. So looking for it was, it was kind of a coup to actually find it. But I figured out that Mary McCompass gave the child she had to Sarah Onepenny, and then I figured out that Mary Indian was the mother of Amy Powamskin, and that Amy Powamskin had to be that child, right? Because she takes on the Powamskin name. Now, in Amy Powamskin's will, which you'll see in a minute, she names her uncle Cornelius Indian. And this is Cornelius's house, which still stands on New Britain Avenue. And it also belonged to Elijah Wampy. They shared the land and a barn and had a farm there. And Amy Powamskin's real name was Sakwama. And in her will, she preserved the native names of her relatives. So we know that her sister Patience was called Mahanik, and her brother was called Sunkway or Sunksquaw. Now, remember I told you Sunksquaw was an elder woman, right? So that seems kind of gender backwards. Amy, if her name was Sakwama, Sakwama was a man, a sachem, right? So I don't know what's going on there exactly, but they're preserving names of their ancestors, but without regard to gender, as far as I can tell. Which, I don't know what to conclude from that, but I think it's interesting. And she names Cornelius Indian as her uncle, and there is a grave in Durham, in the cemetery in Durham, of Anne Cornelius. And I'm not sure how they're related. There is an Anne Cornelius Cushoy who has a son named John Cushoy, who seems to be the son of Sunkway, right, or Sunksquaw, in Amy Powamskin's will. And the document that I have is an indenture where Anne Cornelius Cushoy was indenturing John Cushoy to a colonist for apprentice training. Anyway, putting all these things together is, I think, an important exercise, because often in history books, you'll read about sort of individual native people who aren't attached to anybody, right? There's a wonderful book, it's called, now I always forget the title, Brethren by Nature, right? About enslaved native people in New England by Margaret Newell. It's a really good book. But she mentions Mary McCompass, and she gets a couple things wrong about Mary. She thinks Mary's written a will, which she didn't. Mary was making a declaration. Mary didn't die until the, 1760s or something. And also that what Mary is doing is, she's right that she's trying to protect the daughter from enslavement, right? But she doesn't quite get that this isn't, like I said, like a will, that it's a declaration in the probate court. And Mary's just out there. She doesn't know who Sarah is, right? But by giving Amy to Sarah, Sarah is the sunk squaw of Middletown. She's not nobody. She's really somebody. She's the leader of Middletown. And she is so powerful, she lives as a kind of servant in the house of William Whiting in Hartford. But William Whiting is a military commander, he's a magistrate, and eventually becomes a judge on the Admiralty Court in Newport, Rhode Island. And he takes Sarah One-Penny's grandson, Scipio Two Shoes, with him to Newport, sets him up and helps him set up a business as Scipio Brown, free Negro so-called, because Scipio had an African father. And Scipio becomes the most litigious man in colonial Newport, most litigious man of color in colonial Newport in the 18th century. He's got over 40 lawsuits back and forth. He gets sued, he sues other people. He's an amazing guy. But here we have the last Tungus Indian. Right? All right. By the way, that's not really true. There are still Tungus people. But one of the things that starts to happen is what historian Gene O'Brien calls firsting and lasting. The first Indian to meet the colonists or sell the land or do this was X. And the last Indian was X, right? And so here's a church record abstract from West Hartford. It says, Indian woman died January 21st, 1821, age 98, and then Negro woman found dead, after her. So Indian woman died January 21st. In the Hartford Current, it gets reported that the last male, Tungus, was buried December 21st, 1820. That's clearly the same person. I think, I mean, the dates are like a year off, but and a month off, but I still think it's the same person. The day which completed 2 centuries from the landing of Pilgrims of Plymouth. I think that probably one record or the other was mistranscribed, right? But it's still the pronouncement of the last Indian. Except for the fact that here's Henry Massaco, also called Manasseh. And he's the last Tungus Indian, except he's not. So Henry comes from a very important Tungus family, the Massac family. They were part of the Brothertown movement. Daniel Massac served in the Revolutionary War. A number of them went with the Brothertowns to land in Oneida that the Brothertown Indians had purchased to set up their own government and towns and tribe. Eventually, some of the people who went to Oneida went further west, and the Brothertown tribe now resides in Wisconsin. It is made up mostly of people descended from Connecticut Native people. Anyway, the Massacs were extremely important in Farmington. Their wills and estates were administered. And Henry's father, Luke, died when Henry was only 9. And so a guardianship was set up for Henry. Now, guardianship was a way that colonists could take property from Native people, right? Because they had to sell off the property to pay for his education. Well, Henry very quickly becomes a little thief and a burglar, and then he gets in trouble and he's accused of murder. And eventually goes to the Wethersfield Penitentiary, where he makes that hat. And a number of other baskets and things, becomes a basket maker. But Henry was actually, his sentence was commuted by the governor, because eventually it came out that Henry didn't commit this murder in cold blood. So, but in Farmington records for like infirm people, there's a census, a special census taken of people who are kind of poor and living on the generosity of Farmington in a house where they have, various disabilities. His wife is Margaret Chaugham. Now the Chaugham family is the Lighthouse family at Barkhamsted, right? That's, how many of you have heard of the Lighthouse? There's a wonderful book about it by Ken Fader, if you're interested. The Barkhamsted settlement was a multiracial settlement, whites, blacks, Indians, from the late 18th century, and the Chaughams were Narragansett originally, and married into the Barber family, a white family, and then settled in Barkhamsted. So Ken Fader's book, terrific. Anyway, so Massaco is married to Margaret Chaugham, and they have 2 children. Now, I've never been able to trace beyond that. So I know they had 2 children. I don't know what the sex of the children was. I'm not sure what happens to them. But what I think is that all of this firsting and lasting has resulted in us believing Native people are gone. And they're not. I'm friends with a guy named Gary O'Neill, who's the Wangunk historian, family historian, right? So Gary lives and breathes as we speak. And the Massaco family continued to exist. Puali, or sometimes Pueli Massaco, who had a mixed Native heritage, did move out to Wisconsin, but then came back, settled in Mohegan, left a will. One of her baskets is at the Stanley Whitman House in Farmington. She didn't have any children that survived her, but her baskets do. And as you can see, this one is in the Museum of the American Indian, donated by Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was, I think she died when she was like 104 or something. Gladys was an anthropologist who studied with the most famous anthropologist in U.S. history, Frank Speck. And she created the museum at Mohegan, which you can visit, the Tantaquidgeon Museum. So I'm going to wrap up here. I know I've talked kind of long, but the power of place names. They're all around us. The Nepash family is Wangunk, but they moved westward and settled in the New Hartford area, as did Mary McCompass and the Pawamskins. And you see here Nepash Meadow. Or you probably say Nepash. This is my accent. So, I took such a small shot of it there, but it's over in the New Hartford area. And then, of course, you're surrounded by places named after, and businesses named after Cherry. And there's some folklore about Cherry. The first thing is that Cherry set that fire that killed John Hart. But that seems unlikely that he did that. But the second is the thing that lives on, right? An Indian sachem, Wakwahik, aka Cherry, because of his love of rum, lived near a brook. One day, after a few too many in Oliver Humphrey's tavern, he was cut off. Cherry threatened to scalp Humphrey. This is totally false, because Wakwahik was not alive. Oliver Humphrey was born too late, and Wakwahik died too much before. So the only possibility is that this could be Cherry, who was Warramog's son, and Warramog was a sachem over in the Waterbury area, right? But it also doesn't seem like Warramog's son, who would have been alive, but really had no relationship to Simsbury. So a lot of lore that you read, there might be a kernel of truth to something, but you can't be sure. And some people say, well, he's called Cherry because he liked cherry rum. Who knows? I mean, all of this, I think the important thing here to learn is that alcohol is a continuous thread in folklore about Native people, right? And Native people struggled to overcome addiction to alcohol. They struggled against settlers pushing alcohol on them. And so the alcohol part is perhaps real, but not in this particular instance, right? Not in the way it's portrayed here. And then I've got a bibliography. This is too small to read, but I have cards here. So if anybody would like a copy of the PowerPoint, all you have to do is email me. I'd be happy to send you a PDF, so it won't blow your computer apart when you get it. And that is the end of my talk, so thank you. If people would like to ask questions, I'd be happy to entertain. And I want you to speak into the mic. So.
King Philip was an actual chief?
Yes.
Because there are so many conflicting things that he was not.
Okay, so I'll tell
The
you.
one that started the Simsbury fire.
Okay, so I'll tell you who, King Philip probably was not present where they say he was, and with respect to the Simsbury fire in the cave, right? He's probably not in the cave. Philip, all right, so how many of you are familiar with the sort of Plymouth colony story? Yes or no?
I fled back there.
Right, so, right, oh yes, we had said Philip. So Massaco was the first chief, the first sachem to really greet the Plymouth colonists, right? When the Mayflower landed, this is a great story, when the Mayflower landed, they get off the boat and a native man says to them, a native man named Samoset says to them, "Good cheer, Englishmen." And they're like, "What? You just spoke to us in English." He had been to England. Because there were fishing boats here long before there were colonists, and those fishing boats kidnapped native people. Sometimes native people went willingly, they went to England, and so they knew England. Anyway, Massaco was the first sachem, and they made a treaty. He made a treaty with the Plymouth colonists, and he was Wampanoag, right? Well, Philip was his son. And when Massaco died, normally, of course, it would have passed through matrilineal descent. We don't really know what the matrilineage was here. But it passed to his son Wamsutta, who was named by the colonist Alexander, right, for Alexander the Great. And Philip is named for Philip of Macedonia, Alexander the Great's father, right? So this is a kind of a typical thing for a native man to take on a new name when he takes on new roles. Like, so when he becomes a sachem, when he gets married, he might take on additional names. And so both Alexander and Philip accepted those English names as part of a kind of traditional Wampanoag ceremony in which they have new leadership, right? So when Wamsutta died, Philip took over. Now Wamsutta, although he died in theory of natural causes, Philip was always very suspicious of this. And there were a number of things, we won't go into the whole cause of the war, but there were a number of things that happened where Philip just had enough. And he was sort of cornered out there at Mount Hope in Rhode Island, on a peninsula, and just feeling like we're doomed if we keep this up. And so he gathered other native people around him and went to war. Now, Philip is sometimes called you'll see it like Metacom, right, but Metacom. And that was also his name. So when you see that reference, that is a reference to King Philip. Philip was a very powerful warrior, and he did travel quite a long way. If you're interested in the travels, the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson can take you through a first-person account of an English woman who was captured by King Philip and traveled with him, through his various destinations. And then, yes, Philip was beheaded. He was shot and then beheaded, and his head was put on a pike and carried around and displayed, and then made its way into a museum and various other things. They did that with Oliver Cromwell too, so, and it's kind of a thing. Other questions? Yeah. Here, let me give you the mic so it gets recorded.
So I just wanted to ask for some clarity about the Tunxus people that you mentioned that ventured to Springfield.
Mm-hmm.
And you displayed the names of some of them. And then a few of the names you said were also mentioned as some of the people who came back and burned Simsbury when
Mm-hmm.
asked. So I was just a little confused about when they left their tribe to go up to Springfield. Was it to join with the colonist side of the war?
Yes.
And so when they came back to burn Simsbury, was the purpose of that burning the Massaco, like the
No.
natives, or was it burning the white colonists?
They had become disaffected from the colonial troops
Gotcha.
because of Mosley.
And because of that story that you told
Yes.
about?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Got
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that question. That's a good question. I'm glad you clarified.
What's the last known reservation in this area besides,
Yeah, so the last one, so all of the recognized tribes have reservations now, right? Still, and including some that are not recognized. So the Turkey Hopagussit still have a reservation. It's not recognized by the state. So there are various reservations. But the sort of, I think what you're really asking is kind of when did the last reservation exist for the Tunxus people, which are the people of this area? And it's sort of hard to say how it dissolved. It kind of dissolved because a lot of them went to Oneida. But it was sort of a gradual thing. It wasn't like the Wangunk Reservation where it got sold off and that was the end. And there's actually, if you go to the native Northeast portal, and it's up there in one of those blocks, this gold block here. It's just nativenortheastportal.com. Those are documents that relate to the native people. That's where I got that list of Springfield Indians. And on their homepage, they have a special feature about the Tunxus called Common Unities, Possession, Dispossession, and Community in Tunxus Land Records, 1640 to 1841. So that's a really good resource if you want to read, more about the Tunxus into the 19th century. So this is something about professional historians, right? We have time periods. Mine ends at 1815, and I don't care about anything after 1815, or know anything very much. So that you can read more there. Yes, sir.
You talked about people who had gone to Europe, Indians who had traveled to Europe.
Yes.
I'd love to know who they,
Okay.
I'm just interested in those Indian people who had traveled to Europe to meet with European cultures or governments.
So the most famous people you would have heard of, Squanto and Samoset, right, who greeted the Plymouth colonists, were both in England at various times. But a number of native people traveled to England, sometimes as sailors on ships, right? So a lot of native people and a lot of African-descended people became sailors, so they went. But on diplomatic missions, you had Pocahontas, for example, who died in England and is buried there. The Virginia Indians, I'm talking about Virginia there. Joseph Brant who was, he was a Mohawk chief, went to England and had an audience with the king. But most importantly, I think we have the Mohegan tribe, who in 1736 sent their sachem, Muhammad, his name was Muhammad, sounds kind of strange, but that was his name. In 1736, he went to meet with the Privy Council to argue a land case. And that Mohegan land case is quite famous. He died in England, too, so it didn't get very far. But this kind of travel between the colonies in England was not unusual. And one of the interesting things, so I do know a little 19th century history. I used to teach at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And in the Otago province, there's an Apes Road, A-P-E-S. The Apeses are Pequots. And a whaling ship took one of the Apeses to New Zealand, where he married a Maori woman and now has a road named after him.
Wow.
So people get around. Yeah, Bert.
So at the time of the original land grant in Simsbury, what would the native population of Massaco have been, and where exactly were the settlements?
So where exactly is a good question. I think there's sort of an approximation, well, I don't have a good enough map to really show you, but essentially, I think it's sort of where the core of Simsbury is now, was Massaco. Typically, settlers took over places that were settled by native people, like Sukyot or Hartford, right? Because it was easy, there was good water supply. The lands had been farmed already, so they didn't have to pull up so many rocks and things like that, because the native people were farmers. So I would say probably right around here. But how big? The typical settlement, I think, would have been around 10 families in a village, and that would have included, the sort of nuclear household, right? But all of the families would have been pretty interrelated. So you could have as many as, if you figure a family of 5 for each household, probably 50 to 100 people, depending on how many people had wigwams. And the population was a bit migratory, but they're not nomadic. And I think this is an important point. Just like the English gentry had summer homes, right? They have their home and then they have their summer home. Well, so did the Tungus and the Wangunk and all of the native people of New England. They had their regular home and then they had their summer home. And so people moved about. And this causes a lot of confusion on the part of the colonists, who think that they're abandoning their villages. And this is what happened to Podunk. So I know we always say, like, that's in Podunk, right? You've heard that. But the Podunk were real people, and they had a real village. And then it disappeared because one day they left, and when they came back, colonists had taken it over. And we're like, well, you went away.
Where did they go? Where was the summer home?
I mean, I don't think anybody really knows, but yeah, probably have an asset. Where you go.
I know of a deceased resident of this area that used to go to the river in Weetag every summer when farmers would plow it, and he amassed a collection the size of this room of Indian artifacts, and it was the same thing. They would leave in the winter, go to Rhode Island, come back in the summer, and establish their summer camp.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point that, so for example, Sowe, the Grand Sachem of the Wangunk, had a daughter, Wawarme. If you've ever been to Colt Park, Wawarme Avenue runs right by Colt Park. Well, Wawarme married my Aunt Naomi, the Grand Sachem of the Narragansetts, where she was known as Wabalone. And so, but she came back after my Aunt Naomi was killed by Uncas, the Mohegan Sachem. She came back and she resided over there, near where the street is named after her, in her wigwam. And those wigwams, for one thing, it's interesting, the wigwams could be seen in the South Meadow up until about the 1740s. So a lot longer than you would think. But her son came with her, Massaco, and then he had children. And his daughter, Ascosutic, married Cushoy, the sachem of Middletown. And when she married him, she brought with her to the marriage 17,000 acres of Narragansett country, which they sold, unfortunately. And when she died in 1785, she was being taken care of by a colonist, not a colonist, a townsperson in Middletown, paid for by the town for her care. So that wasn't exactly what it was, but one on a tangent.
You talked about, when you first started the presentation, about Hartford and the colonists and Indigenous people. Do we know anything about the Dutch relationship, before the English were in Hartford, the Dutch were there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The Dutch had a very different relationship to the native people than the English. So, first of all, I think they were less afraid of consorting with them in various ways. And the Dutch were really interested in the wampum trade. This is part of what starts the Pequot War, is trying to get the wampum trade away from the Dutch and the Pequot, and into the hands of the English colonists, because it was very lucrative. But the Dutch really had a fort. They didn't have a settlement. So it was mostly men. There were some women there, but, and there were enslaved people there. The first person of African descent that we know of to die in Hartford was murdered by his Dutch master. So in 1639. So, but the Dutch got along pretty well with the native people, but they never had enough of a substantial population in this part to really help the native people against the English in any way. Now, the relationship with the native people in New York and in New Jersey very much dependent on rulers. So there's a thing called Chiefs War that happens around the same time as the Pequot War into the 1640s. And that war, the Dutch just slaughter native people. I mean, so they're no better than the English. It really depends on what they're trying to do. And the Dutch are primarily traders. And if they have a good trade relationship, they're fine. And if they don't, look out.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.